Jake Palmer's boots splashed through the shallow puddles forming along the asphalt, each step heavier than the last as the relentless rain pelted his shoulders and soaked through the fabric of his worn t-shirt. The dim glow of the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting faint, elongated shadows that stretched behind him like silent witnesses to the chaos of his life. He was late, 10 minutes late, but that wasn't the half of it. His mind was still reeling from the night before, from the memory of helping a stranger in the rain, a stranger whose face now haunted him not in terror, but in awe. The man's need had been raw, human, and unavoidable, and Jake had acted instinctively without thought for his own exhaustion, his own responsibilities, or even the consequences. That stranger, Franklin Spencer, had seemed frail at first glance. His expensive suit drenched and clinging uncomfortably, his polished shoes now slick with mud, and his hand trembling against the car he'd parked awkwardly on the side of the road. Yet beneath that veneer of vulnerability was an authority that Jake would only fully comprehend later. That night, as Franklin slid into the pickup truck and allowed Jake to drive him to the young man's modest apartment, there was a quiet exchange of glances, a silent acknowledgement of two lives intersecting for reasons neither fully understood. Jake didn't ask who Franklin was, and Franklin didn't question Jake's motives. Sometimes, the simplest acts of kindness required no explanation at all. Back at the River Bend diner that morning, Jake's troubles compounded. The drizzle had not ceased, and neither had his misfortunes. His old Ford sputtered and coughed, betraying him at the worst possible time, forcing him to arrive late at the diner. A diner where every minute counted, where routine mattered more than empathy, and where his manager, Shane Bowers, measured worth strictly in numbers and punctuality. Shane's black leather shoes clicked against the floor as he approached, each step punctuating the words he hurled like weapons. "Do you own a watch, Palmer?" Shane's voice carried over the subdued murmur of the early customers, the morning rush held in an uncharacteristic suspended tension. Jake tried to explain, tried to convey the importance of his actions the night before, the man he had helped, the simple decency he had extended, but Shane was deaf to reasoning. To him, Jake's compassion was nothing more than negligence, a liability, a stain on the diner's pristine reputation. The firing was swift. An apron was handed over the counter like a relic of failure, and Jake left the diner with a heart heavier than the storm clouds above. He didn't notice the black sedan parked across the street, nor the man inside who had silently observed every humiliating word. Franklin Spencer had seen it all, and the moment was etched in his mind. The injustice, the cruelty, and the quiet dignity of the man who had just lost his livelihood for doing the right thing. That moment would fuel the transformation that was about to unfold, not only for Jake but for the diner, for Shane, and for every soul touched by this chain of events. Jake trudged through the puddles, mind racing with concern for his daughter Lydia. The thought of her, curled up at home, perhaps waking briefly to see her father's absence, spurred him forward. The early morning stillness of the Cincinnati suburbs enveloped him, punctuated only by the rhythm of his own steps and the persistent drumming of rain. Memories of his late wife Sarah surfaced, unbidden yet painfully sharp, as they always did in these moments of quiet solitude. 2 years had passed since her death, yet the void lingered, present in every aspect of his daily life, from sleepless nights to lonely dinners, from Lydia's tender questions to the weight of financial uncertainty that never ceased pressing down on him. The drive that night, rescuing Franklin, had been more than just a detour. It had been a moment of catharsis, a subtle reminder that human decency still existed in a world increasingly governed by indifference. Franklin's gratitude, expressed in his quiet, almost trembling voice as he accepted shelter in Jake's modest apartment, was the first ripple in a series of events that would culminate in the diner's transformation. They shared stories that night, small anecdotes about life's hardships, laughter that pierced the heaviness of loss, and the gentle warmth of connection. Franklin spoke of a world dominated by figures with power, numbers, and influence, yet he had forgotten the value of a simple human gesture. Jake spoke of love, loss, resilience, and the unspoken contract between parent and child, between human and humanity. In those hours, the two men, strangers yet irrevocably linked by circumstance, forged a bond that neither could have predicted. By dawn, Franklin had left quietly, leaving only a small handwritten note expressing his gratitude, a tangible reminder of the profound impact of an uncalculated act of kindness. Jake returned to his routines, picking Lydia up for school, attending to household chores, and preparing for his shift at the diner. The old Ford gave him one last rebellion before starting, leaving him 10 minutes behind schedule. Little did he know that Franklin, now aware of Jake's identity and his place in the diner hierarchy, had begun to orchestrate a series of events that would not only restore Jake's dignity, but also realign the moral compass of River Bend Diner itself. As Jake stepped into the diner that morning, he was met with a silence that spoke volumes. Shane's eyes locked onto him with a mixture of disdain and self-righteousness, and the usual chatter of the patrons seemed to dissipate, leaving only the echo of judgment. Jake's heart pounded as he tried to navigate the torrent of shame, the sting of humiliation, and the weight of his responsibilities. It was then that Franklin Spencer entered the diner, not as a man in need, but as the very authority Jake had unknowingly served the night before. His presence commanded the space immediately. The polished suit, the quiet confidence, the aura of a man who could influence more than just the diner's finances. Shane's demeanor shifted instantly, his arrogance faltering in the face of unspoken authority. The confrontation that followed was precise and deliberate. Franklin's words were measured but sharp, cutting through the pretense and exposing the truth of Jake's character. He acknowledged Jake's act of selfless kindness and juxtaposed it against Shane's rigid, unempathetic management style. When Franklin reinstated Jake and elevated him to co-manager in front of the entire diner, it was more than just a reversal of fortune. It was a public acknowledgement of moral integrity, a declaration that compassion and decency held value beyond mere punctuality or numerical metrics. The applause that followed, hesitant at first and then genuine, was a chorus of justice witnessed by all present, a tangible reinforcement that good actions, though often unseen, are eventually recognized. In the weeks that followed, the diner transformed. Jake's new responsibilities as co-manager were a challenge, but he approached them with the same dedication and integrity he had shown in his life outside the diner. Small discrepancies in accounts, subtle abuses of authority, and the quiet undercurrents of discontent were addressed not with anger, but with vigilance, patience, and a commitment to fairness. Franklin's presence, whether physical or in council via phone or video, reinforced the principles that had begun to take root: accountability, empathy, and human connection. Meanwhile, Shane's attitude had shifted into a cold, calculated silence, a subtle warning that the path he had chosen would have consequences if repeated. At home, Jake's world was equally charged with small victories and tender moments. Lydia, vibrant and perceptive beyond her years, observed the weariness etched on her father's face and prompted conversations that were equal parts insight and comfort. Her innocence and unwavering love provided him a reservoir of strength he could draw upon during the most trying days. Together, they navigated the ordinary struggles of life: homework, meals, bills, while carrying the extraordinary weight of recent events. Every action, every word, every choice was influenced by the lessons learned that rainy night, by the quiet acknowledgement that one act of kindness could ripple outward in ways unimaginable. Jake's reflection on that first night with Franklin became a guiding principle. Morality is not dictated by circumstance, and decency is not measured by reward. The ripple effect of that night, from an encounter on a deserted street to the reshaping of an entire workplace, demonstrated the transformative power of human connection. Every small act, every moment of courage or kindness, could set in motion events that transcended ordinary expectation. By the time he lay down each night, tired but resolute, Jake understood that the measure of life was not in wealth, status, or recognition, but in the integrity of one's actions and the compassion shown to others. And so, as the rain subsided outside, leaving the streets glistening and reflective, Jake Palmer's story had only just begun. The diner, once a stage for humiliation and rigid adherence to rules, now hummed with life, laughter, and respect. The invisible threads of kindness, loyalty, and integrity wove through every corner of the space, binding not just employees and customers, but the very fabric of the community it served. Franklin Spencer, once merely a stranger, had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that even in a world dominated by wealth and influence, the simplest human gestures could redefine destiny. The days following Jake Palmer's reinstatement carried a strange, uneasy calm, like the silence that settles after a storm but before the next wave breaks. On the surface, River Bend Diner appeared normal. Customers flowed in and out, plates clattered, coffee was poured, and the familiar smell of bacon and toast hung in the air. Yet beneath that routine, something fundamental had shifted. Power dynamics had changed, and not everyone was at peace with it. Jake felt it the moment he tied his apron each morning. The staff greeted him with warmth and respect that had never been openly shown before. Colt gave him firm nods from the kitchen, Emma smiled more confidently, and even regular customers seemed to treat him differently, offering encouraging words or subtle looks of approval. But Shane Bowers was different. His politeness felt rehearsed, his smiles brittle. Where he once barked orders, he now spoke softly. But the silence behind his eyes carried resentment, sharp and unresolved. Jake tried not to let it bother him. Franklin had trusted him with responsibility, not just a title. He knew this opportunity wasn't merely about personal redemption. It was about protecting the integrity of the diner and the people who worked there. Every decision he made, every report he reviewed, he approached with the same care he gave his daughter Lydia when she crossed the street, alert, protective, and deeply invested. Late one afternoon, Jake sat alone in the small back office, flipping through expense reports and cash logs. The office smelled faintly of old paper and cleaning solution, a place that once symbolized intimidation but now felt like a space of accountability. As his eyes scanned the numbers, a subtle pattern emerged. Small discrepancies. Nothing dramatic, $40 here, $75 there, but frequent enough to raise concern. The kind of irregularities that could easily be dismissed as clerical errors or deliberately overlooked. Jake leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He didn't want to assume the worst. Accusations once made couldn't be taken back. Still, Franklin's words echoed in his mind, respect people but verify systems. That evening, after closing, Jake stayed late under the pretense of organizing supply orders. He watched quietly as Emma and Colt clocked out and said their goodbyes. Shane lingered, claiming paperwork needed finishing. Jake nodded and left the office door slightly ajar as he moved to the storage area. From the dim hallway, he could see the register through the reflection in the glass. At exactly 10:47 p.m., Shane approached the counter. His movements were deliberate. He opened the register, glanced over his shoulder, then removed several bills and slipped them into his jacket pocket. Jake's heart sank. He waited until Shane left, then returned to the office and rewound the security footage. There it was, clear, undeniable. One instance, but one wasn't enough. Jake knew better. He documented the time, saved the clip, and locked the file away. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Lydia slept peacefully beside her teddy bear, unaware of the storm gathering in her father's thoughts. Jake stared at the ceiling, torn between anger and disappointment. He had never wanted Shane's position. He had only wanted fairness. And yet here he was, faced with a truth that could dismantle everything if mishandled. The next morning, Jake called Franklin. "I didn't want to believe it," Jake said quietly, standing in the diner's parking lot as dawn broke over Cincinnati. "But I have footage. Shane took money from the register." Franklin didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was calm but firm. Don't confront him, not yet. I'll handle this properly. Within 48 hours, Nolan Gray arrived. Nolan blended in effortlessly, jeans, leather jacket, casual posture. To anyone else, he was just another customer nursing coffee, but Jake knew better. Nolan's eyes missed nothing. For days, he came and went at different hours, ordering meals, sitting in different corners, quietly recording patterns. Each visit added another layer of confirmation. By Friday evening, the evidence was overwhelming. Nolan laid everything out at a nearby cafe. Videos, timestamps, altered logs, bank deposits that didn't match reported income. Over $3,000 stolen across months. Jake felt sick, not because of the money, but because of the betrayal. This isn't about need, Franklin said grimly. It's about control. The plan was set: Monday morning, public, transparent, final. That weekend crawled by. Shane behaved as usual, laughing with customers, issuing calm instructions, completely unaware that every step he took was being measured. Jake forced himself to act normal, though the tension sat in his chest like a weight. On Sunday night, Lydia sensed it. "You're worried again," she said softly, climbing into his bed. Jake smiled sadly, a little. She hugged him tight. "Mom says when you do the right thing, even if you're scared, everything works out." Jake closed his eyes, swallowing the lump in his throat. Monday arrived. At 8:45 a.m., Franklin Spencer walked into River Bend Diner, followed by Nolan. The air shifted instantly. Conversations quieted. Shane's smile froze. Minutes later, the staff gathered. Customers watched in silence. Franklin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He spoke clearly, calmly, directly. The evidence played. Denial crumbled into desperation, desperation into silence. When the police arrived, the sound of handcuffs echoed louder than any applause ever had. As Shane was led away, he looked at Jake with bitterness and disbelief. "You think you're better than me," he spat. Jake met his gaze steadily. "No, I just chose not to become you." When the door closed behind Shane, something lifted from the room, a tension no one realized they'd been carrying. Applause followed, not loud, not celebratory, just right. In the weeks that followed, River Bend Diner changed in ways numbers alone couldn't explain. Staff turnover stopped. Customers lingered longer. Reviews mentioned words like warm, fair, human. Jake didn't chase growth, he nurtured trust. Franklin watched from a distance, proud not of profits, but of purpose. One rainy evening months later, Jake stood outside the diner as an old car sputtered to a stop nearby. A confused man stepped out, rain soaking his coat. Jake didn't hesitate. "Need some help, sir?" As the man looked up, surprised and relieved, the circle quietly continued. Because kindness, once set in motion, doesn't end. Time has a way of revealing the true weight of change, not in grand announcements or dramatic moments, but in the quiet details people begin to notice without trying. For Jake Palmer, that realization came one early morning as he unlocked the doors of River Bend Diner and stepped inside alone. The lights flickered on, illuminating clean counters, neatly arranged chairs, and a space that felt lighter than it ever had before. It wasn't just that Shane was gone. It was that fear was gone with him. Jake stood there for a moment, keys still in his hand, breathing in the familiar scent of coffee grounds and polished wood. This place had once been a source of anxiety, a battlefield where he walked on eggshells every day. Now, it felt like something else entirely. A responsibility, yes, but also a promise. He moved behind the counter and began his routine, the one he had followed for years. Yet even the routine felt different. He no longer rushed with dread in his chest or flinched at the sound of footsteps behind him. Every action carried intention now. Every choice mattered. By 7 o'clock, Emma arrived, her posture straighter, her expression brighter. She greeted Jake with an easy smile that no longer carried caution. "Morning, boss," she teased lightly. Jake chuckled. "Morning, coffee's fresh." Colt arrived shortly after, already arguing cheerfully with Emma about the radio station. The kitchen filled with sound, laughter mixing with the sizzle of the grill. Customers trickled in, regulars who had been coming for years, and new faces drawn by word of mouth and glowing reviews. People noticed when a place felt honest. Franklin had warned Jake early on that leadership wasn't about authority, it was about consistency. Doing the right thing once was admirable. Doing it every day, even when it was inconvenient, was what truly defined character. Jake took that to heart. He made a point of listening. When a dishwasher mentioned struggling with late bus schedules, Jake adjusted shifts. When a supplier tried to sneak in inflated prices, Jake questioned the invoice instead of signing blindly. When a customer complained, he didn't dismiss them. He listened, apologized if needed, and fixed what could be fixed. Slowly, the diner became something more than a workplace. It became safe. But change, even good change, has a way of attracting attention, and not all of it welcome. 2 months after Shane's arrest, Jake received an email that made his stomach tighten. It was from a regional restaurant group expressing interest in River Bend Diner. They praised its recent success, its increased revenue, its positive public image, and suggested a meeting to discuss future opportunities. Jake forwarded the email to Franklin. They met that evening after closing, sitting at Franklin's usual corner table. Outside, the Ohio River reflected the glow of streetlights, calm and steady. "They want to buy us," Jake said quietly. Franklin nodded. "Or turn us into something else." Jake frowned. "Is that bad?" Franklin studied him for a moment before answering. "Not always, but it depends on the cost." The meeting happened the following week. Two well-dressed executives arrived, smiles polished, words smooth. They talked about expansion, branding, efficiency. They showed charts and projections, promises of higher profit margins. Then came the fine print. Standardized staff hours, automated systems, reduced labor costs. Jake read between the lines easily now. "They want to cut people," he said afterward, once the executives were gone. Franklin nodded. "They want to optimize, which usually means removing the human part." Jake thought of Emma saving for college, Colt finally hearing an assistant, the dishwasher who relied on steady hours to support his mother. "This place works because of the people," Jake said firmly. "If we lose that, we lose everything." Franklin smiled faintly. "That's the answer I was hoping you'd give." They declined the offer. The decision wasn't easy. Turning down a lucrative deal never was. But almost immediately, Jake felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. This was right. Not everyone agreed. Rumors began circulating, whispers about missed opportunities and bad business sense. A local blog questioned whether Jake Palmer was qualified to co-manage a successful diner. Anonymous comments speculated that Franklin was making decisions based on emotion, not logic. Jake tried not to let it get to him, but the doubt crept in anyway. Late at night, after Lydia was asleep, he would sit at the small kitchen table, staring at spreadsheets, wondering if he was failing everyone by choosing values over growth. One night, Lydia padded into the room in her pajamas and climbed into his lap. "You look sad again," she said softly. Jake smiled tiredly, "Just thinking." She tilted her head. "Mom says when grown-ups think too much, it's because they're afraid to make the wrong choice." Jake swallowed. "What if I already made it?" Lydia shook her head with childlike certainty. "Then you wouldn't feel this way. Wrong choices feel easy at first. Right ones feel heavy." Jake hugged her tightly, eyes burning. The next test came sooner than expected. A former employee of Shane's, someone from his previous job, came forward with a civil lawsuit, claiming wrongful termination years earlier. Shane, desperate and bitter, named River Bend Diner and Franklin Spencer as part of a pattern of abusive management. It was baseless, but it was loud. Media attention followed, reporters called, customers asked questions, online speculation surged. Jake felt the weight return. Franklin handled the legal side calmly, but Jake saw the toll it took. Not financially, Franklin had resources, but emotionally. This diner was no longer just an investment, it was personal. During a particularly tense week, Jake stayed late to help close. As he locked the doors, he noticed Franklin standing by the window, staring out at the river. "Do you regret it?" Jake asked quietly. Franklin turned surprised. "Regret what?" "Getting involved, standing up for me, for this place." Franklin shook his head slowly. "No, I regret waiting so long in my life to do something that mattered." The lawsuit eventually collapsed. Evidence surfaced. Shane's credibility crumbled. The story shifted from accusation to exposure. And something unexpected happened. Support poured in. Customers wrote letters. Former employees shared stories. The community rallied, not because River Bend Diner was perfect, but because it was honest. A local paper ran a feature titled "A Diner That Chose People Over Profit." Jake didn't frame the article. He didn't need to. He saw the impact every day in the way people lingered longer, talked more, smiled easier. One afternoon, while Jake was helping a new employee learn the register, Emma approached him hesitantly. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Of course." "Why didn't you leave?" she asked. "After everything that happened, you could have gone somewhere else. Better pay, less stress." Jake thought for a moment. "Because this place gave me a chance when I had nothing," he said. "And because I know what it's like to need someone to stay." Emma nodded, eyes glistening. That evening, Jake drove home through light rain, the same kind of rain that had started everything. He parked, sat for a moment, and looked up at the sky. "Still doing my best," he whispered. Inside, Lydia was at the table drawing. She held up the paper proudly. It showed a diner, bright and warm, with people holding hands inside. Above it, she had written carefully, "River Bend Diner." And in that moment, Jake understood something clearly for the first time. This story had never been about punishment or reward. It was about choice. And the hardest part, the part that truly mattered, was still unfolding. The quiet after victory is often more unsettling than the storm itself. Once the lawsuit faded from headlines and life at River Bend Diner returned to its steady rhythm, Jake found himself facing a different kind of challenge. One without a clear enemy or obvious resolution. Success, he was learning, demanded more than survival. Autumn arrived slowly, brushing the town with gold and amber. Business at the diner continued to grow, but with growth came pressure. The equipment was aging. The kitchen needed upgrades. Staff schedules were stretched thin during peak hours. Jake spent more time balancing budgets and negotiating deliveries than he ever had flipping burgers or pouring coffee. He was proud but exhausted. One evening, long after closing, Jake sat alone in the booth Franklin always used, staring at a stack of invoices. Numbers blurred together. He rubbed his eyes, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest, the same one he used to feel under Shane's shadow. Franklin noticed it immediately the next morning. "You're carrying this like it's a burden," Franklin said calmly, watching Jake move through the kitchen with tense precision. "It is a burden," Jake replied. "A good one, but still heavy." Franklin nodded. "Then it's time you stop carrying it alone." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Franklin slid a folder across the counter. Inside were documents, operational plans, training outlines, profit-sharing proposals. "I didn't invest in this place to control it," Franklin said. "I invested because I saw what it could become under the right hands. Yours." Jake's throat tightened. "I'm not a businessman like you." Franklin smiled. "Neither was I when I started. I just learned faster after I failed. The proposal was simple in theory, terrifying in reality. Jake would formally step into a managing partner role. More authority, more responsibility, more risk, more visibility. Jake took the folder home that night, unable to sleep. He sat at the kitchen table until dawn, rereading every page, imagining every possible way he could ruin everything. When the sun finally rose, Lydia joined him quietly, carrying her blanket. "You're thinking too much again," she said. Jake laughed weakly. "Is it that obvious?" She climbed onto the chair across from him. "If you don't try, you'll always wonder. If you do try and fail, you'll still know you were brave." Jake looked at her, stunned by how easily wisdom came from such a small voice. He signed the papers later that day. The change was subtle at first, but it reshaped everything. Jake began implementing systems Franklin had designed years ago but never enforced. Training became structured. Communication improved. For the first time, employees saw a clear future, not just a job. Not everyone welcomed it. A senior cook named Harold pushed back openly. He had been at the diner longer than Jake and resented taking direction from someone he still viewed as the kid who almost got fired. Tension simmered for weeks until it finally boiled over during a busy Saturday lunch rush. Orders backed up. Voices rose. Harold slammed a pan down and stormed out mid-shift. The kitchen froze. Jake stepped outside moments later, heart pounding. Harold stood by the alley, cigarette shaking between his fingers. "You embarrassed me," Harold snapped. "I corrected you," Jake replied calmly. "There's a difference." Harold scoffed. "You think wearing a title makes you better." Jake shook his head. "No, but walking away from your team when they need you, that makes things worse for everyone." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Harold exhaled heavily. "I don't know how to take orders from someone I trained." Jake met his eyes. "Then don't see me as someone above you. See me as someone responsible for all of us." Harold stared at the ground, then crushed the cigarette under his shoe. He went back inside without another word. From that day on, things changed. Not because authority was enforced, but because respect was earned. Meanwhile, Franklin's health began to quietly decline. He never complained, but Jake noticed the signs. The longer pauses, the way Franklin leaned a little heavier on his cane, the rare days he didn't come in at all. One afternoon, Franklin called Jake to his home. The house was elegant but subdued, filled with memories rather than noise. Franklin sat by the window, sunlight catching the silver in his hair. "I want you to take full operational control," Franklin said without preamble. Jake's chest tightened. "You're not stepping away." "I am," Franklin replied gently. "Not because I'm done caring, but because you're ready." Jake felt fear rise sharply. "What if I'm not?" Franklin smiled. "That question is exactly why you are." The transition was announced quietly. No press, no spectacle, just trust passed from one man to another. Jake felt the weight immediately. Every decision now rested on him. Payroll, compliance, reputation. The diner's future no longer felt like a shared responsibility. It felt like a promise he had sworn to keep. Then came the storm. A supply chain disruption caused shortages across the region. Prices spiked. Smaller businesses struggled. Some nearby diners closed within weeks. River Bend Diner stood on uncertain ground. Jake faced a choice he had feared since the beginning: raise prices or cut costs. He gathered the staff after closing one night. No scripts, no corporate language. "I won't lie to you," Jake said. "This is going to be hard, but I won't decide alone." They talked for hours. Ideas surfaced. Temporary menu adjustments, reduced waste, voluntary shift swaps. Everyone gave something. No one was laid off. When customers noticed slight changes, Jake told them the truth. And instead of leaving, they stayed. Some even tipped more. The diner endured. Late one night, Jake sat alone again, this time not in fear but in reflection. He realized something important. Power had once been used here to control. Now it was being used to protect. As winter approached, Franklin visited less frequently, but when he did, he always smiled as he watched the diner hum with life. "You've built something strong," he told Jake one evening, "stronger than I ever imagined." Jake shook his head. "We did." Franklin's eyes softened. "That's the difference." Outside, snow began to fall lightly, coating the street in quiet white. Jake locked the doors, turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the stillness. He no longer felt like a man reacting to events. He felt like someone shaping them. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the final test, one that would define everything he had become, was drawing closer. The final test did not arrive with warning signs or dramatic buildup. It came quietly, the way the most important moments often do, disguised as an ordinary day. Winter had settled fully over the town. Snow lined the sidewalks, and River Bend Diner glowed warmly against the cold, its windows fogged from the heat inside and the steady rhythm of life it held. Jake arrived before sunrise, as he always did now, keys familiar in his hand, breath visible in the air. Inside, the diner felt alive even before anyone else arrived. Not because of noise, but because of memory. Every table carried a story. Every corner held proof of how far they had come. Jake poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the counter, letting the quiet speak. The phone rang. It was the hospital. Franklin had been admitted overnight. Jake didn't wait for details. He locked up and drove through the snow with a heaviness he couldn't name. By the time he reached the hospital, the sky had turned a pale gray, the kind that made everything feel suspended in time. Franklin was awake when Jake entered the room, weaker, thinner, but still unmistakably himself. "You came fast," Franklin said softly. Jake swallowed. "Of course." They sat in silence for a moment, machines humming gently around them. "I won't be going back to the diner," Franklin said calmly. Jake's chest tightened. "You'll recover." Franklin smiled faintly. "From this, yes. From time, no." Jake looked away, eyes burning. "I didn't bring you here to say goodbye," Franklin continued. "I brought you here to finish something." He reached for the folder on the bedside table and handed it to Jake. Inside were final documents, full ownership, no conditions, no oversight. Jake stared at the pages, stunned. "I can't take this." "You already have," Franklin said gently. "Not on paper, in practice." Jake's voice shook. "I wouldn't be here without you." Franklin nodded. "And that's why this works. You didn't climb over people, you carried them with you." Tears fell freely now. "Promise me something," Franklin said. "Anything. Never let fear decide for you again, and never forget who you built this for." Jake nodded, unable to speak. When he left the hospital, snow was falling harder, covering the road behind him. For the first time, Jake understood what legacy truly meant, not wealth passed down but values passed forward. The announcement was made a week later. Franklin retired quietly. No press conference, no applause, just a handwritten note on the diner's bulletin board thanking the staff and the town for giving him a second purpose late in life. Jake became the sole owner of River Bend Diner. Some expected changes. They didn't come. The diner stayed honest, the food stayed warm, the people stayed first. On a busy Friday night, the place was full, families, workers, travelers escaping the cold. Laughter echoed, plates clinked, life moved forward. Jake stood behind the counter, watching it all, when Lydia appeared beside him, holding his hand. "This is ours now," she said quietly. Jake smiled. "It always was." Outside, a man hesitated before entering, shaking snow from his coat. Jake noticed immediately. Something in the way he stood uncertainly, unsure if he belonged. Jake stepped forward, opened the door, and smiled. "Come on in," he said. "You're welcome here." And in that moment, the story completed its circle. A man once humiliated in front of strangers had become someone who made room for them. Not because of revenge, not because of luck, but because he chose integrity when no one was watching. Because he chose people over power, courage over fear, purpose over pride. And if this story reminded you that kindness still matters, that standing up quietly can change everything, then don't let it end here. Backhand index pointing, right like this story, if you believe character outlives cruelty. Backhand index pointing, right, share it with someone who needs hope today. Backhand index pointing, right, subscribe for more powerful, real-life inspired stories that prove the smallest choices can create the greatest change.